were badly neglected. Just as important as the fighter pilots were the RAF and civilian personnel responsible for keeping the aircraft at the highest state of combat readiness. A daily inspection was carried out on every machine, and after a sortie, as a squadron landed, each fighter was met by its ground crew, including an armourer and his assistants, a fitter, a rigger, and a radio mechanic. Aircraft were normally checked for damage, refueled, and rearmed in 35 minutes. Behind the ground crew were the maintenance mechanics, highly skilled men who serviced the fighters' overworked engines and airframes, often in very primitive conditions. The station workshops also carried out what repairs they could, but if the damage was too great, the aircraft was dispatched to the civilian repair organisation. Under Beaverbrook's Ministry of Aircraft Production, the repair units achieved near miraculous results. Over 60% of all the fighters sent to the organisation returned to combat. Complete fighters were made by cannibalising damaged aircraft, and during the battle, 1/3 of all new fighters to reach the squadrons would come from repair units. While Britain's fighters were the major weapon against enemy raiders, the ground defences would also play an important part, mainly by forcing bombers to fly higher and so spoiling their aim. Anti-Aircraft Command, a branch of the Army, was led by the energetic and effective General Sir Edward Pyle, who worked closely with Fighter Command. In July 1940, Pyle had only 4,000 guns, almost half of them light weapons, and about the same number of searchlights. At night, or on cloudy days, accurate shooting was all but impossible. There were few of the new gun-laying radars, and gunners had to depend on all but useless sound locators. The second component of the ground defences was a force of barrage balloons. Balloons were meant to discourage low-flying bombers, particularly at night, and were handled by a 12-man team made up of RAF personnel. Because the mile of cable connecting the balloon to the ground could easily be severed by an enemy aircraft without causing the raider to crash, a system called the double parachute link was devised to make the balloon a truly lethal obstacle. When hit by an aircraft, the cable would separate from the balloon and the winch. While the cable was being trailed by the aircraft, it would deploy 2 small parachutes, which would cause a sudden drag of about 2 tons, stopping the raider dead in its tracks. With the double parachute link, the barrage balloon was a powerful deterrent to low-flying bombers. However, in the summer of 1940, there were far too few balloons for an adequate defence. Only 1,400 barrage balloons were available to protect key sites around the country. The German campaign in Western Europe, although a triumph for the Luftwaffe, had not been won without cost. Almost 1,500 aircraft had been lost in combat and operational accidents in less than 2 months. Now, the force was expected to go on the offensive against Britain without the rest and replenishment it so badly needed. Although Goering believed that wars were to be won by strategic bombing, his air force had never been equipped to fulfill that role. The Luftwaffe had developed as a tactical weapon whose task was to support a ground offensive. It had numerous bombers, but the emphasis was on relatively short-range types, able to carry only a modest load. Altogether, the Luftwaffe had 4,500 aircraft. Of these, almost 1,600 bombers and 1,100 fighters would be deployed for the battle, about 70% of them fit for combat. The Messerschmitt 109 was Germany's only modern single-engined fighter. Its overall performance was comparable to the Spitfire, but it was more effective at high altitudes and better in a dive. Unlike British fighters, which were fitted with carburettors, the 109 had fuel injection and could dive suddenly without stalling, an advantage many would use to evade opponents in the battle. Like the Spitfire, the 109's handling was heavy at high speeds. It had no tendency to spin, although its very delicate wings meant that German pilots were reluctant to turn as hard as their British counterparts. The aircraft's takeoff was extremely short, and its climb was excellent. But on the ground, the 109's narrow undercarriage and poor view made it a difficult machine to handle, and 5% of all 109s built would be destroyed in landing accidents. The Messerschmitt 110 two-seater was intended as a long-range escort fighter, the first aircraft of its type in the world. After its naval counterpart, it was known as a destroyer. Goering saw his destroyer squadrons as the elite of the Luftwaffe, and their pilots were the best available. But the aircraft would be a disaster in the Battle of Britain. Although formidably armed and much faster than the Hurricane, the 110 was too cumbersome a machine to take on the Spitfire. Before the end of the battle, destroyers would suffer the indignity of needing to be escorted by 109s. The Junkers 87 Stuka was designed as a precision dive bomber, whose main role was to support infantry actions. As long as it operated in areas in which the Luftwaffe controlled the skies, it was a formidable weapon, its bombing accurate to within 100 feet. The Stuka was fitted with sirens to strike terror into the enemy, and automatic dive brakes to pull it out of its steep attack. In spite of the Stuka's ungainly appearance, it handled well. Its controls were light, and for its size, the aircraft was very maneuverable. Cockpit visibility was excellent, but compared with single-seat fighters, the two-seater Stuka was slow and poorly armed. When it first entered service, the Heinkel 111 was one of the most outstanding aircraft of its day. By the time of the Battle of Britain, although it was still a formidable weapon and had been updated many times, the design was beginning to show its limitations. The 111 was heavily armoured and well armed, but the aircraft was underpowered and slow.